So in this video, I'd like to discuss with you representations of Medusa in Greek art. And if we have a look at her in the Archaic period, you'll see that she very much fulfills an apotropaic function. That means that she wards off evil, very much like gargoyles on Gothic cathedrals. And you can see that she does this from the images that I've shown you here by staring out at the viewer from the temple. And she often does this when other individuals in the scene are in side profile. So it's really, really obvious that she is intending to fulfill a different function to those. On top of that as well, if you look at her facial features, they're often rather exaggerated and monstrous. So she has these large eyes. She often has her tongue stuck out as well. And of course, we famously know as well that Medusa, with her snakes for hair, will turn whoever looks at her to stone. So just that very fact is also apotropaic in its nature too. Now, this kind of function of Medusa as apotropaic, or even her monstrous appearance here in the frontal face, is not just found in Greek art. So I thought it'd be interesting just to show you some examples or some parallels from elsewhere. So to start with, this is a clay mask from Babylon. So we would be talking about Iraq today. And it shows the demon Huara or Humbaba that Gilgamesh slain. So this was a giant slain by Gilgamesh. And if we look at it, we can see many of the same features, the large eyes, the fact that it faces out towards the viewer. In addition, we've got this Aztec calendar found in what would be Mexico City today. This dates all the way back to 1479 BC. And the figure in the centre is meant to be a representation of the sun, but again, the tongue stuck out, facing out in general towards the viewer. And this image also has earrings, which a number of archaic Medusas do as well. There's more. If we have a look here, this is a Kirti Moha image from a Hindu temple, often found on Hindu temples. And whilst we've got the more kind of lionesque appearance of this one, again, you can see it faces out at the viewer. We've got the large eyes. So there are many, many parallels with other cultures. Finally, we've also got the Egyptian god Bes. And not very much is known about this particular god because it seems to be that evidence associated with him was passed down in terms of oral tradition. But nonetheless, we can see that these kinds of images are very, very similar to the archaic images of Gorgons and, of course, Medusa. It's not always the case that Medusa is apotropaic when it comes to Greek art. So I'm fast forwarding here now to the classical period and a scene by the Pan painter, which we will look at in more detail shortly. But this is Medusa's head after it has been severed by Perseus. And it's in the bag. Its eyes are closed. She looks almost serene, but it's lost that power from the eyes to turn whoever looks at it to stone. So we tend to see a very different Medusa as we move on in Greek art. She's not as fearsome and monstrous as we start off. There's this additional image here from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And you can see here we've got Athene, Perseus, but Medusa's actually asleep. And there are many vessels or vases that show Medusa as a more beautiful female. They also show her asleep because they want to portray her in a more victim-like way. So, the representations of Medusa do change as we go through art, and it is worth noting that in discussions of her. Now, if we think about the Perseus and Medusa story, the narrative, and how that is now told in art, what we find is that different artists tend to focus on different moments. So, for example, we're looking here at the pediment from the Temple of Artemis at Corcyra. Medusa was obviously taking centre stage there in her very archaic running kneeling pose. But in terms of what moment of the story the artist has chosen to focus on, it at first seems rather confusing. Because if you look to Medusa's left, and what would have been originally on her right, Pegasus, you can see the outline of him there, are her children, Chrysaor and Pegasus. Now, if anyone knows the story of Medusa very well, you'll know that these children were born from the kind of bloodied stump of her neck that Perseus had removed her head from. So they shouldn't be here at this moment because Medusa has still got her head on. It's something that we see elsewhere as well. For example, here, this is from Temple C at Selinus in Sicily. We've got clearly Pegasus being held by Medusa, but we've also got Medusa still with her head. And yet Perseus also seems to be holding it up, implying that he's already beheaded her. These two images are what we can refer to as synoptic images. They're trying to show different moments of the same story in a one still image kind of way. So it can be a bit confusing at first, but once you get your head around the fact that they're trying to do something synoptic, it's a bit easier. In the case of the temple from Corcyra that we're looking at here as well, there's an additional reason for them wanting to show a synoptic scene. Corcyra was a colony of Corinth, and Corinth is famously the birthplace of Pegasus, and he's associated with it. He appears on the coins there. So they're giving a little bit of a nod back to their original mother state, shall we say. When it comes to the Gorgon vase here by the Gorgon painter, we've got a rather different moment. We've actually got Medusa's sisters pursuing Perseus, and we can see here from the centre image that Medusa's already been beheaded. She's fallen to the ground, and in this case it's her sisters that offer the apotropaic function because they're the ones staring out at us instead. And finally, a very different take on the Perseus and Medusa scene, but a reminder that this one is classical. So we're seeing a move on from the apotropaic function. This is the Pan painter's Perseus and Medusa, and this time it's the moment again after she's already been beheaded, but we see Athene's involvement, more active involvement, and overall a much more quirky and comical retelling of the scene. I mean, look at Athene. She's almost prancing. She lifts her skirt daintily to one side. We can even see her leg underneath the drapery. Medusa rather strangely props herself up, and yet we assume that she should be dead at this moment. She's certainly got a head in Perseus's bag. Perseus leaps forwards but looks back behind him to see kind of the aftermath of the particular scene. And as I previously mentioned, Medusa looks almost content or asleep in the bag there. So this is a very different retelling, but it's typical of this particular artist. That's what we're seeing. He's known as having a bit of a quirky charm to him. So just to finish off, I want to think about what scholarship might be applicable if you were talking about how Medusa appears in art. So if you want to make a point about her apotropaic function early on, this is something that Nigel Spivey points out to us. Moynard has a wonderful quote that vases are speaking objects which can tell us a story about their makers and owners and their lives and priorities. So the art tells us something about the values of ancient Greek society and their fears and their beliefs. And Liz Gloyn actually takes this further for us. She points out it's very noticeable just how many monsters turn out to be women. And you've only got to read the Odyssey to know that, from the Sirens, Scylla, Charybdis. And she says even if they are male, like centaurs, they're hypersexualized and hyper-violent. So reflecting what happens without the controlling influence of civilization. So she's kind of explaining what some of the fears and values of Greek society might be, and why many of their monsters turn out to be female, because they're, for example, worried about this lack of control and what happens if they don't act like good Greek women. And finally, if you want something more about the stylistic qualities of how scenes of Medusa are put forward by Greek artists, Sparks describes the Perseus and Medusa scene by the Pan painter as a dainty ballet dance, which is a lovely one to finish off with there.